Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Carla Conti. She is the author of Chain Birds, a true crime memoir, and it's the true story of her 10-year journey to advocate for federal inmate Kevin Sanders and help him re enter society after prison. More will learn from her. Welcome to the show, Carla.
Thank you, AJ, for having me.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show. Welcome to India in this online form, Carla. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will learn about your story, about what we'll be talking about a journalist's dangerous journey to expose prison abuse. We'll learn all this from you. But before that, Carla, just to understand better, about this particular, how did you get into this story? It means a journalist is normally they go, they report, and normally they do not want to be part of the story. So we want to learn about your story from you, whatever is possible for you to share, as to let the audience know who exactly is Carla Conti and how she got into this story.
Okay, AJ. So, a little more than 10 years ago, a high school friend of mine who is an attorney brought me into his criminal defense case because he needed a way to try to raise money for his defendant. His defendant was Kevin Sanders, an inmate at a federal prison who was brought up on charges in a recreational cage stabbing. So my friend Scott was defending him, and he asked me to write a story about him because of my journalism background and to make a website so we could raise money for his defense team. And one thing led to another, and then my friend Scott really needed help with his case, and he asked me to be part of the defense team. And that's how I got to know his client, Kevin Sanders, who was in prison in Pennsylvania. And I got to know him over the course of a decade and learned all kinds of very dark and dangerous things about the prison world that I otherwise would not have known.
Right, Carla. So, what was the problem there? Means people report about not so good things, and prison is a very public sort of a place. If things are not good, you do talk about it. You just tell about it. Uh, how did things, uh, did were not did not were for some people's liking, and why was it? Means you were doing your job, you were doing your story. I want to understand the discomfort of the system about it.
Right. So, in federal prison and state prisons, and I don't know if this is something similar internationally, but here in the United States, uh, it's very common for prison gangs to have a large influence and control inside of a prison. And they are race based gangs. So if you are white or Caucasian, you will fall under a white supremacist gang like the Aryan Brotherhood. There are Hispanic gangs if you are of Hispanic descent, and black gangs, etc. So Kevin Sanders, because he is white, fell under the Aryan Brotherhood, and you are forced to do what the leadership of the prison gang tells you to do. You get protection from that gang, but you also have to follow orders. And his predicament, one of his predicaments, started when he was inside a recreation cage and he was told that he had to assault a fellow inmate because the Aryan Brotherhood wanted that to happen. And it also turned out that the correctional officers, the people in charge of the prison, were colluding with the prison gang to make this assault happen also. So when Kevin was inside this wreck cage, he had no choice but to at least attempt to make it look like he was assaulting this other inmate. He had a cellmate with him at the time, and the other inmate actually had a knife or a shank and did the damage to the other inmate who survived. And Kevin, our client, just pretended to do it to make it look good. And the reason he had to pretend is because his cellmate who had the knife could have turned that knife on him immediately for not helping because it was an order to do so.
Right, right. So, uh, and that is where Kevin must have then entered into the bad books of these people.
Yes, very much so. Well, at the time, they thought he had participated fully because he made it look pretty good using his fists and a thrusting motion that made it look like he might have had a knife. But there was no knife from him, just the other person in the wreck cage had the knife. So this is the incident that led to the charges that my friend and attorney had to defend him against. And as part of the defense team, a lot of this information came out on the witness stand, and it's how I started to learn about what went on in federal prison generally, but very specifically to this one prison in Pennsylvania. There was a lot of corruption. There were a lot of abuses. It was a prison that was set up to house the very worst, violent criminals in the federal system in the US. And they were locked down almost 24/7 in very austere conditions, two inmates to a cell that was really the size of a car parking space, very tiny. And they were just on top of each other all the time, only allowed outside for recreation 1 hour a day for 5 days a week, one shower 3 times a week. It was a very difficult program that was a misguided attempt to try to make the other prisons safer. And it just led to a lot of abuse and corruption and was eventually closed.
Okay, okay. So you reported quite a bit on that prison abuse.
Yes, I did. And in along the way, two different prison gangs became aware that a book was in the works, that Kevin Sanders, the inmate, wanted to tell his story, and I was going to help him. And those prison gangs were not happy about the story coming out in a book. And that is one of the reasons that it took me a long time to write the story, and also why I write it under a pseudonym. I use a pen name and I don't show my face in public. I had a lot of misgivings over the years about putting his story in a book form because I was concerned when he would be released from prison, would he have to look over his shoulder all the time because the gangs still wanted some revenge against him for testifying, for trying to tell the truth about the system and putting it in a book. And I was very concerned for his safety. My safety became an issue at one point, and also my attorney friend Scott. The three of us were kind of linked together with threats hanging over us because we wanted to tell the truth and get this information out there.
Right. So, do you still fear for your safety now that the prison is closed and the book is out now, isn't it, Carla?
Yes, the book just came out last week. I feel that because more time has gone by between these incidents, that it is a better situation than it was. I cannot say that the threat level is zero. So, just to be on the safest side possible, I try to keep my face out of the public square. But I'm very happy that the story is finally out because it needed to be told. And it finally was the right time to tell the story.
Absolutely. And this is the name of the story, the book, Chain Birds, a true crime memoir. So tell us about how have you dealt in this particular story in your book? Was it easy for journalists? You always look at the facts here. Here it's a different sort of a thing, writing a memoir, crime memoir. So tell us uh, about this whole writing process, as well as how did you put out all those things, especially when you were a part of it all.
When I first thought about writing the story, I was approaching it strictly from a journalistic point, using Kevin as an inside source. I also had contact with other inmates. I was getting other inmates' stories. So putting the journalism part together felt very natural for me, given my background as a newspaper reporter. And across the 10-year period, I stopped writing the story. I'd pick it back up. I'd stop writing it. I'd pick it back up. And later, toward the release, I realized I was part of the story, that I could not separate myself from the story, that it could not just be straight on journalism told from a third person perspective. For better or worse, I was part of the story. So, Kevin, my attorney friend Scott, and we were the three main characters. And that was strange, to be writing my thoughts and feelings and how I interjected into this path that we were all led on. But in the end, I think it's the most genuine version of this story. And it is the version that my publisher was interested in. They wanted me to tell the truth, and they were very accommodating to allow me to write under a pseudonym and allow me to change the names of some of the real people and change some of the locations for security reasons.
Right, Carl. So, what does the book intend to achieve? Is it? Let me understand from you.
I believe one of the takeaways is the understanding that the prison program that no longer exists was very misguided from the beginning. And for people to recognize that we have a lot of failings in our criminal justice system and our prison system in the US, and to try to take some lessons from that so that another program like that won't ever be created again in the future. And I hope people will recognize that incarcerated people, prisoners, they have hardly any voice, they have no agency, and they deserve humane treatment. Uh, our system in the US is very different from other prison systems across the country or across the world. I'm familiar with statistics from our counterparts in Europe, where they have a much lower recidivism rate, meaning the rate that people are released from prison and then they go back into prison. The people in Europe seem to do it better. They have better programs for these inmates once they're released. Um, just a better social structure and support network for these inmates. And they don't end up going back to prison the way they do as much in the US. So I hope that those are some of the takeaways that people will have from the book.
Right, right, Carla. There are lots of people involved with bringing a lot of changes to prison systems everywhere. In the US, it is supposed to be quite an aware people, aware administration, strong media in that sense. Uh, why do you think it still happens that way? Is that even movies have been made from from early on to even now also now. Why hasn't things changed so much as it was needed?
Well, I don't know what it's like in India and other countries, but there has been a movement in the United States recently to privatize prisons. In other words, have them be run
Oh,
outside of local and federal governments. And those are for profit institutions. They benefit by having people incarcerated, they benefit from a high recidivism rate. And one of the reasons privatization has happened is because there is not enough funding from the governments for the prisons that are needed. There isn't enough funding for enough correctional officers. Certainly in the federal system, it's always chronically underfunded. And it's up to the government and the legislatures to appropriate enough money for these programs to be better. And that just doesn't happen.
right, right, Carla. Uh, Chained birds. Miss, how did you get this idea of this particular, title of this book? It's a nice name, and but uh, we call them birds. A lot of these birds are also not so innocent, and that is why perhaps a lot of prison system, all those people who are there, uh, they also do not have the mindset to think too much. They just think whoever has come there to that place must have been guilty in some way or the other.
Oh, without a doubt, the prisons are filled with guilty people who've done horrific things. Um, so, in a way, chained birds represents all kinds of inmates, right? But specifically, it relates to Kevin, the inmate at the heart of my book, because the the cover of the book, as you see, has a bird on it, and it comes from a sketch that Kevin drew, one of the earliest sketches that he drew for me and for Scott, my friend. And it's a predatory bird. It appears to be an eagle, and the eagle has a chain around its foot, also attached to a tree branch, but the chain is actually cut. And so the bird is technically not chained to the branch anymore because the chain is broken. And I always looked at that sketch and thought, why doesn't that bird fly away? The bird is just sitting there. And when I decided to write the book for sure, I thought Chained Bird would make the perfect title. But as you can see, the title actually is Chained Birds, plural, more than one bird. And I have to give all that credit to my mother, who is a retired English teacher. And she was one of the first people to read my manuscript. And she told me when I had the title Chained Bird, just one, she said that's utterly misleading. That Scott and I were also chained birds, and we were chained to Kevin. And so the title needed to be chained to Chained Birds, plural.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You also mentioned about redemption through storytelling. Tell us about this redemption here.
Hmm. Well, I suppose that I feel somewhat redeemed in finally telling the story after years of not wanting to write this story, not following through on it. It was an act of closure for me, to kind of put to bed a dark chapter in my life, even though some good things came out of it. And I suppose that that's where that redemption comes from. I think in some ways, Kevin's soul has been redeemed because he was able to get some of his stories out, and they did appear in the book finally. And I believe that's some redemption for him as well.
Right. So, where is Kevin now? Where is Scott now?
Well, Scott has moved from the location where the story began. He has a new family. I get more into that at the end of the book. And without giving away spoilers, the status for Kevin remains somewhat of a mystery. He was eventually released from prison, and Scott and I were able to help him, or try to help him to a certain extent, even though we were on opposite parts of the country, which is very large, as you know, here in the US. And his story got very complicated after he was released, and it's a bit of a mystery. And depending on the traction or the attention this book gets, he might have a reappearance or a different ending for himself that we will become aware of, but that remains to be seen.
Right. And what happens to Carla Conti? Is it going to continue? Carla Conti will continue to live on, or you will get back to your original self?
Carla Conti has at least five more books ready to be written.
Right.
One of them I even discussed in Chained Birds. I'm going to pick up a story that I started a couple of decades ago that I recently uncovered in boxes from my basement. It's a true crime story that takes place in my state of Pennsylvania, and it involves a murder, a love triangle murder from the 1970s, and some interesting things that happened to the players in that story that now have a kind of a new twist, or new information has come out about it. And I feel that that's probably my next book to write.
Right. Right. And in terms of chain birds, how is the public reaction till now? It's been a week or so.
Well, I've had a lot of great editorial reviews, critical reviews. Uh, those reviewers have liked it. One in particular called it a future true crime classic. So those were lovely words to hear. Readers are starting to weigh in with their reviews. I've had some early reader reviews, uh, mostly very positive. But once the larger public becomes aware of the book, we'll find out if the topic is too heavy, too dark, or if I have told the story in enough of an entertaining way that they want to find out what happens to all of these characters and they learn something along the way. At least that's my hope.
Absolutely. And normally, in my podcast, Carla, I generally ask people to tell them where people can connect with them. But here, I don't think it will be a very wise thing to do so. I guess they will have to go for the book directly. So
Well, I
where
do
can
have a
they?
blog online under my
Okay,
name, Carla Conti. So
okay,
it's very easy to look up. And I'm also on social media under my name. So
okay. So how to get to the blog?
how to get to the blog is
Yes.
carlajeanconti.com. And all my social media handles are Carla Jean Conti. So I'm pretty easy to look up.
Right. And people can buy the book from your website or they'll have to go to any
Uh,
of the.
Amazon, or my publisher is Wild Blue Press. People can be led to the book that way, but Amazon is a very easy way to find the book.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Nice learning about the story of yours, Carla, and also the book itself that it contains that story. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me, AJ. It was a pleasure.